Let me introduce our guest today. This is episode 3 of the APPA Book Club series. And today's guest is Massimo Pigliucci. He's an author, blogger, podcaster. I will add an APPA certified philosophical counselor. And he's the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. His academic work is in evolutionary biology, philosophy of science, which I should say, I believe you have a PhD in biology and in philosophy.
Yeah.
He works on the nature of pseudoscience and practical philosophy. Massimo publishes a regular column in the philosophy magazine, Philosophy Now, entitled The Art of Living. His books include How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, basic books, which we'll be discussing today. And Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, from the University of Chicago Press, about which book I recall attending a great presentation he gave once on the topic at the Cornelia Street Cafe in Greenwich Village in New York City.
Right.
That was fun.
Which unfortunately it's gone,
Yeah, the place shut down. I gave a presentation there. Lou gave a pretation there. It was a nice venue.
Maybe that's why they shut down, Rick.
That's possible.
That's why we shut them down. It could be.
That's possible.
Yeah. What was his name? The Gotham Philosophical Society fellow,
right,
who used to organize that. I can't remember his name.
That's right.
Massimo's newest book is called Beyond Stoicism, A Guide to the Good Life with Stoics, Skeptics, Epicureans, and Other Ancient Philosophers, with Greg Lopez and Meredith Kunz. The Experiment, what does that mean?
That's the publisher. That's the
publisher.
Name of the publisher.
Okay.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And for more information about Massimo, you can go to his website, massimopigliucci.org. And also on the web, thephilosophygarden.substack.com for his Substack. Now, here's a brief book description that Massimo prepared about today's book topic, which may be helpful for those who may not have read the book yet. Massimo says, whenever we worry about what to eat, how to love, or simply how to be happy, we are worrying about how to lead a good life. No goal is more elusive. In How to Be a Stoic, Massimo offers Stoicism, the ancient philosophy that inspired the great emperor Marcus Aurelius, as the best way to attain it. Stoicism is a pragmatic philosophy that focuses our attention on what is possible and gives us perspective on what is unimportant. By understanding Stoicism, we can learn to answer crucial questions, such as, should we get married or divorced? How should we handle our money in a world nearly destroyed by a financial crisis? How can we survive great personal tragedy? Whoever we are, Stoicism has something for us. And How to Be a Stoic is the essential guide. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Massimo to the APPA Book Club series. Thanks for coming today, Massimo.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
Great. Massimo, tell us about yourself. Well, you've been on the APPA Agora. You've been on my Philosophy of Meditation series with John Vervaeke, and you've been on many other YouTube channels and podcast interviews. So many of this will be repetitious for a number of us here, but for some of our listeners, this will be new information. So please tell us again how you came to philosophy first, then how you came to Stoicism.
Well, in both cases, actually, this was a little bit of the result of a midlife crisis. My first academic career was in biology. I was an evolutionary biologist for about 20 years or so. And, at some point you get to the point where you are a full professor with tenure, the lab is going well, you got graduate students, postdocs, well-funded, blah, blah, blah. And then you start asking yourself, but do I want to keep doing this for another 20, 30 years or whatever it is? And so my answer immediately was, no, not really. I need to do something else. Now, this is actually not unusual. A lot of academics do get somewhere in the middle age, in my case, a little early middle age, and start asking themselves those questions, especially if there is a sabbatical coming up. And so you have time to explore and look around. But typically they look in adjacent fields, so from evolutionary biology to, let's say, ecology or molecular biology or something like that, not to philosophy. In my case, however, what happened was, on the one hand, I had a love for philosophy ever since I encountered the subject first, and that was in high school. I grew up in Italy, in Rome, And I had to take 3 years of philosophy in high school, and my teacher was just absolutely wonderful. She made the subject really come alive. She was outstanding, and so that was one thing. She kind of sort of got me into it way before I actually started going to college and then starting my academic career. So there was that in kind of in the background, the back of my mind. When this kind of crisis was happening, I was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and the University of Tennessee just happened to have hired a young, bright philosopher of science named Jonathan Kaplan. He had just defended his thesis at Stanford, and his thesis was on nature-nurture issues. Now, it turns out at the time, as a biologist, that's exactly what I was studying. Biologists called them gene-environment interactions, but it's about the same thing. And so Jonathan looked me up when he came to campus, when he was hired at the University of Tennessee. He looked me up. He said, I've studied your work. Why don't we go out for a cup of coffee? We hit it off immediately. We became friends. He started coming to my lab meetings. We started collaborating on co-authored papers. And at some point I said, Jonathan, hey, here's an idea. How about I go back to school, I get my PhD in philosophy, and you be my mentor? And his first reaction was like, how many glasses of wine did you have today? And I said, I don't usually drink it at lunch anyway. So he said, this is crazy. You are a full professor at tenure. I'm an assistant professor pre-tenure. It's like, the dean is not going to go for it. And instead, the dean did go for it. And she did because of a very special kind of set of circumstances. I'm not going to get into it, but we got an agreement with the dean. So I pursued my PhD. Basically, what I was doing for 3 or a little bit more than 3 years was I was running the lab in the morning, teaching in the biology department, and then walking to the other side of campus, taking evening classes in philosophy and working on my dissertation during the weekends. In other words, I had no life for that time, right? But it worked out. And then I left Tennessee. I went to Stony Brook still as a biologist. But in the meantime, then I took a few years to kind of really decidedly shift completely to philosophy. What happened was that at some point, I realized that I could apply for jobs in either biology or philosophy because I had, pretty good number of publications in either field. Turns out that a job came out at CUNY, and I applied, and they hired me. This was at Lehman College before I moved to City College. So that's the career part. That's what happened in terms of, it took a few years, and it took a little bit of a midlife crisis. That same midlife crisis was also personal, not just career-oriented, not just professional. What happened was, and in a very short period of time, I was hit with a divorce that I was not expecting. My father died. I had to, for career-related reasons, I had to change city, change job, et cetera. Now, any psychologist will tell you that one of those things is pretty stressful. If they happen simultaneously in a span of a few months, they really can do a job on you. And so I thought, okay, I need some kind of resources to deal with this situation. Now, when I was growing up in Italy, I was a Catholic. But I left the church when I was a teenager, and ever since I consider myself a secular humanist. And so I thought, okay, well, this is the time to figure out whether secular humanism has the resources that are going to be useful in this kind of crisis situation. And it turns out, at least in my mind, no, it didn't. Secular humanism is, I still consider myself a secular humanist. I think the basic idea of the philosophy are right, but it turns out it did not actually have the kind of practical tools that would allow you to actually deal with that sort of more or less existential crisis, so to speak. So I systematically started looking into different philosophies, philosophies of life. And I started actually with Buddhism because a number of my friends told me so. And I found Buddhism very interesting, but it just didn't really click with me for whatever reasons. Then I realized very, very quickly that I would probably gravitate toward virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics usually means Aristotle, so I started studying Aristotle. Interesting guy, lots of interesting things to say, but that also didn't click. Then I explored Epicureanism, also very interesting. I liked the emphasis on friendship and a simple life, but there too there were things that just were not for me. And while I was going through this process, one day on what at the time was called Twitter, now X, I saw this thing that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because, of course, I thought the Stoics, you're talking about Mr. Spock from Star Trek, stiff upper lip and suppressing emotion kind of stuff. Turns out, no, those are actually misunderstanding of Stoicism. Maybe we'll get to that a little later. So I was curious because I then realized, wait a minute, hold on. But Stoicism was also a type of virtue ethics. I had actually read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations in college, and I realized that when I was in high school, I translated Seneca from Latin. So I said, okay, wait a minute, maybe there is something to this thing. And so I signed up, and here we are, more than 10 years later, still talking about it.
Great, wonderful story. I think I've heard it a few times now. Every time I find something in it I didn't really appreciate the last time. So thank you for sharing that with us again. I should put the spotlight on myself too. All right, next question. Why did you write this book, Massimo?
That's another sort of funny story in a sense. So once I started getting into Stoicism and I signed up for Stoic Week and all that sort of stuff, then I thought, well, this is actually really interesting. The first Stoic philosopher that I read was Epictetus, and he really did click with me. It really was something that's like, wow, why have I not heard of this guy before? And so I got into it and I said, okay, well, let me keep going. After Stoic Week, I'll commit for another month of practice and then another 2 months and so on. After a while that I was doing this, I wrote to Peter Capano, he works for the New York Times, and at the time he was running the Stone website for the New York Times. The Stone, as in the Philosopher's Stone, of course. And I sent him an email and I said, Peter, I had written for the Stone before. I had written about science and pseudoscience, which is actually what I do in my day job, right, as a philosopher of science. So Peter knew me. And I said, Peter, here's an unusual proposal. I said, I just started recently practicing Stoicism. I'm doing kind of an experiment on myself. Would you be interested in a column for the Stone about the experiences of a professional philosopher trying out Stoicism? And he said, oh, absolutely. This sounds great. Just write it and we'll get it out. Okay. So I wrote the column, which was called How to Be a Stoic. And it's still available. People can Google it, find it on the New York Times. And the column comes out. The following day, Peter calls me up and says, I'm really glad that we did this column thing because it is the most emailed article on the site. And I said, wow, interesting. I said, you mean the Stone site? And he said, no, the New York Times. Oh. I said, what? Who are all these people that are interested in Stoicism? Okay. So I hung up with Peter, and then an hour later, I was in my office at City College. An hour later, the phone rings again, which is very unusual. Nobody ever calls my number at work. And I said, hello. And he said, hi, we are from, I'm calling from Penguin. We saw, the publisher. We saw this column in the New York Times. By any chance, are you thinking of writing a book about this thing? And I said, no, actually, I'm not. It was kind of an experiment. But, that sounds like an interesting idea. All right, so hang up. An hour later, hi, we are from Princeton Press. We saw the column yesterday in the New York Times. Are you by any chance writing a book? Well, I don't know. I'll think about it. I'll let you know. And then a third call comes in, this time from an Italian publisher, actually, Garzanti, which eventually did publish the Italian translation of How to Be a Stoic. And they said the same thing, are you thinking about writing a book? And I said, yes, absolutely. My agent would be in touch with you. So I was stunned, and I thought, what the hell is going on here? I talked to my agent later, and she explained to me that, of course, as you know, there are publishing houses have what they call acquisition editors, right? So people that go around looking for new authors, new topics, stuff like that. And one of the things that acquisition editors do is they pay attention to stuff that surprises them. that did not expect them to happen. So when these people saw that a column about Stoicism, an obscure Greco-Roman philosophy from 2.5 millennia ago, got all of a sudden the most emailed article on the New York Times website, I thought, there must be something. And they were right, actually, because as it turns out, I did sign a contract and write, of course, How to Be a Stoic, which is right there behind me. And it's by far the book that I wrote that sold the best. It's been a bestseller. It's translated in 12 or 13 languages. So I'm really glad that I changed my mind and wrote the book. But it was kind of weird. It was like a very strange sensation.
That's amazing. Yet another story of one little thing, a little article that goes viral, and bam, something like a book and a career comes out of it. Well, a career shift on your part.
Yes.
Excellent, beautiful story. All right, so tell us some of the main ideas in this book, Massimo, please.
So the book is an introduction to both ancient and modern Stoicism, which means there is a little bit of theory and then there is some kind of practice, because Stoicism is a practical philosophy, so you gotta do the practice. But the structure of the book really follows the thinking of Epictetus, the guy that I just mentioned a minute ago. The book is divided into 3 parts, and the 3 parts follow the so-called 3 disciplines of Epictetus. Epictetus thought that there are 3 major things you want to be concerned with if you're a Stoic. One is to figure out the difference between good and evil, so to speak, or a little bit more modestly, perhaps, to figure out what your priorities should be. What is it that you should be paying attention, and what is it that it's not actually that important? Where should you focus your efforts, your agencies? That's the first discipline. It's called.
I was just going to say, but you just were about to say it's called. I was going to ask you, what does he call it?
That's right. It's called the discipline of desire and aversion. Desire meaning what your values should be, what you want, and aversions, of course, are the opposite of your desire. So your disvalues, the kind of stuff that you want to stay away from. Now, once you figure that one out, once you figure what is important in life and what is not important in life, then you have to act on it, right? Then you have to actually implement it in your daily life, especially in terms of your interactions with other people. So the second discipline is called the discipline of action, because it deals exactly with how to implement your approach to life, your priorities. And then there is a third discipline, which is a little bit more weird, but it does make sense once you grasp the basic concept. It's called the discipline of assent. Assent means, when you agree with something, obviously. And, if I'm assenting to something, I'm agreeing to something. Or if I'm withdrawing or denying assent, that means I'm disagreeing with something. Well, Epictetus thought that the first 2 disciplines, desire and action, really depend on your ability to arrive at correct judgments. Because if you don't have correct judgments, then you're going to make mistakes, both in the theory, so to speak, the discipline of desire, and in the practice, the discipline of action. So the third discipline of assent, is really about honing your judgment, to getting better and better at your judgment. The way Epictetus puts it is like, ideally, you want to get to the point where you arrive at good judgments, even if you are sick or tired or drunk or whatever, no matter what the conditions are. And you do that by constantly paying attention to your judgments and refining them critically. So exposing yourself to criticism by other people, reflecting on what you've done, and trying to improve it on a constant basis. So these are the 3 disciplines, and the book is actually organized around these 3, and it just brings the reader chapter by chapter into more and more sophisticated applications, let's say, practical applications of the 3 disciplines.
Excellent. Those 3 things remind me of 3 things on the Buddhist Eightfold Path.
Right.
The discipline of assent would be right view, I think. The discipline of desire would be right intention, and then right action is
right action.
Discipline of action.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier John Vervaeke, that I interviewed you with him on our Philosophy of Meditation podcast. You probably know John advocates that people who wish to live philosophy as a way of life should engage in what he calls an ecology of practices. Not just meditation, let's just say. He's kind of resisting the McMindfulness thing where all you need to do is meditate.
I love that, McMindfulness.
Yeah, and like a sample of 4 things that would constitute an ecology of practices is the DIME, the DIME framework, he calls it. D for dialogical practice, which is philosophical dialogue. An imaginal practice, which might involve journaling or some kind of, imagination, visualization, whatever, simulating things. A meditative practice of some sort, and some sort of embodiment practice like Tai Chi, yoga, exercise, whatever. Yep. I think Stoicism may be thought to offer a fairly comprehensive ecology of practices on analysis, which may be at least summarized in terms of the three disciplines of desire, action, and assent, which I mentioned earlier. They seem similar to those 3 components of the Eightfold Path. So could you overview any aspects of those 3 disciplines that might illustrate the idea that Stoicism constitutes a kind of complete ecology of practices? Because I think it does, and there are a lot of exercises that I'm sure you know about, and you could share, or at least outline some of them with us.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that Epictetus would agree with your analysis. The exercises are kind of scattered throughout the 3 disciplines. So if you read the discourses by Epictetus or his manual, the Enchiridion, you'll find that there are practices scattered throughout. In some cases, in a number of cases, actually, Epictetus identifies them explicitly as practices. Like he tells his students, you should be doing this or that. You should be try this or that, or etc. I should say, by the way,
to interrupt, the idea is for the listeners, some things that they can actually do if they want to start living like a Stoic.
Right, exactly. And some of these practices, I should perhaps give a little bit more of a background before we get into the practices. So Epictetus didn't actually write anything down. He was like Socrates. He just never wrote books. Lucky for us, Socrates had Plato and Epictetus had Arian of Nicomedia, who was a really interesting guy. He was eventually went on. He was one of Epictetus' students. He went on to become governor of the Roman province of Cappadocia in modern Turkey, and then eventually, after he retired, he wrote a wonderful biography of Alexander the Great. So, fortunately for us, Arian was paying attention and he was taking notes. And what we have, the Discourses, is in 4 volumes. Unfortunately, we only have half of the original length. We lost about half of them. And then the Enchiridion is a tiny little manual. It's only 53 short paragraphs, which is supposed to be not an introduction to Stoicism. Actually, it's for advanced students. People often make the mistake of picking up the Enchiridion and say, "Oh, this is short, so I'm gonna get through it quickly." The problem is it's actually for advanced students. So if you have not read the Discourses, you will make no sense of the Enchiridion. But what we get in both the Discourses and the Enchiridion is not Epictetus' lectures. So he was, from what we know, he was lecturing during the day. He established a school in Nicopolis, which is in northwestern Greece, after he was exiled by the Emperor Domitian, who didn't like philosophers, and he threw them out of Italy because philosophers had this nasty habit of speaking truth to power, and as you know, power doesn't like to be spoken truth to. So Epictetus went to Nicopolis. He established his school there, and during the day, presumably, he was teaching the 3 major topics that we know were taught in Stoic schools, and those would be ethics, understood as the broad study of how to live your life, essentially. Physics, which was understood as an account of how the world works. So we would today call that a combination of science and metaphysics. And logic, which was understood as anything to do with good reasoning. So not only what we call logic, but also, psychology, cognitive science, cognitive biases, all that sort of stuff.
Rationality in the process.
Rationality, etc. Right, especially practical rationality. So that's what Epictetus was doing during the day, teaching those 3 things. Then in the evening, after dinner, he would have these open sessions with his students where he would talk just about anything that the students were interested in. And that's what we get in the Discourses. So it's a great book because it gives you actually a sense of what was going on in terms of conversations at the school. So in these conversations, as I said, in both, especially the discourses, Epictetus occasionally points out, they say, okay, this is something that you want to practice. Okay, this is something you want to do on a regular basis. And which brings us back to your concept that you were talking about sort of an ecology, if you will, of approaches. So there is the theory, of course, right? They were studying, as I said, they were studying logic, ethics, and physics, science. And then there was the practice. And in fact, there were a lot of practices. After I wrote How to Be a Stoic, a friend of mine and I, Greg Lopez, wrote another book called The Handbook for New Stoics. And that one included a whopping 52 exercises that we actually got mostly from Epictetus. Some of them are from Marcus Aurelius and some of them are from Seneca. Each one of those exercises is documented in terms of the ancient texts, and then we kind of updated it on the basis of what modern cognitive science might say about that topic. Now, to give you a couple of examples. So you mentioned journaling, for instance. That's certainly a Stoic practice as well.
Marcus Aurelius'
right,
meditations is his journal, yeah?
The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius is an example of philosophical journaling. And we have very good empirical evidence from cognitive behavioral therapy that kind of stuff really is useful. And in fact, it's useful in the way in which Marcus was doing it. There are a couple of interesting things about the meditations that kind of surprise or maybe even put off people the first time that they read it, but then they kind of make sense. First of all, the meditations is written in the second person, as if he were writing to a friend. Right? So, oh, you did this today, and why did you act in that way, et cetera, right? So it's like writing to somebody else. Why? Well, cognitive behavioral therapy says that actually helps because it helps you get a distant emotional distance from your own
Solomon
actions.
effect, it's called, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so that's what Marcus does. The other thing that he does on a regular basis is he engages in an exercise of staying away as much as possible from emotional sort of language, and instead adopt an extremely analytical language, sometimes to the point of it almost looks like a parody. One of my favorite passages in the Meditations is at some point Marcus says, well, remember that wonderful meal you had today was just a dead fish, and that great Falernian wine. Falernian was one of the most, appreciated wines in ancient Rome. It's just fermented grape juice. And then he keeps going on and on like this. And then he says, and having sex, it's just rubbing, friction of surfaces in an explosion of mucus. It's like, wow, this guy is certainly not a romantic person, is he? But he's doing that on purpose. And again, there is pretty good evidence from modern cognitive behavioral therapy that this thing actually works. What he's trying to do is to deconstruct, analyze, things that he felt he was a little too attracted by.
Buddhists do a similar practice.
Right, yeah.
The corpse and all that, pus and urine, Yeah.
Exactly. It's a reminder of the real aspect, the real nature of things, which is supposed to counter situations in which you are a little too enamored with certain things. Like we know that Marcus liked sex. He had 13 children, 14 children, something like that. When his wife died, he got he took a mistress. So we know he liked sex. He liked, of course, good food and good wine and so on. So what he's trying to do there is to remind himself that, yeah, these things are pleasurable. That's fine. There's contrary to sort of standard misconceptions about Stoicism, the Stoics don't have a problem with pleasure. Pleasure, Seneca says, it's in agreement with nature, meaning it's a natural thing. And pain, conversely, is against nature, meaning that we naturally try to avoid pain. But both of those things need to be treated as what the Stoics call indifference. Indifference doesn't mean something that doesn't matter or that you don't care about. It means they do not make a difference. To what? To the most important thing, which is your judgment, your character. Right? So Stoicism can be understood in great part as a philosophy that helps you to develop your character in order to improve your judgment. Why? Well, the argument for that was given by Socrates in the Euthydemus. because if you have good judgment, everything else follows, right? If you don't, then you can be the luckiest person in the world, but you're going to be making missteps anyway. You're gonna just waste whatever fortune sends your way. So you have to have good judgment.
Yeah, Socrates thought bad judgment was what we call weakness of will.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
It wasn't really that you were weak against something that you really understood to be bad. You were lured in by the appearance of its goodness, which on some level, the salience of that eclipsed your awareness of how bad it is for you.
That's right. So now, so I mentioned the journaling, therefore, as one of the techniques, and that's certainly a major aspect of Stoic practice. There are also some more physical practices, because the Stoics, particularly Musonius Rufus, who was Epictetus' teacher in Rome in the first century, Musonius Rufus wrote that there is obviously a very strong connection between the mind and the body. The Stoics were monist from that perspective. They thought that the mind, what they called the soul, is made of matter and it has causal powers and it dies with the body. And so there is no distinction between mind and body. It's all one thing.
Contemporary view.
It is a very contemporary view. And so what they thought, therefore, is like you got to take care of your body just as much as your mind, because the two interact constantly. And so you can't just say, oh, I'm going to do one and then let the other one go. Well, how do you do that? So you do a series of practices of mild, and I emphasize mild, self-deprivation.
And willful adversity.
Yes, willful adversity. So, for instance, you fast once or twice a week. You abstain from if you drink alcohol normally, you abstain from alcohol once or two nights a week, or something like that. Or you take a cold shower, or you go out. Seneca, for instance, says, I go out underdressed in the cold, just so that I experience. In part, is a question of experiencing nature as it is. With less shielding from our sort of cultural accoutrements, but also it's a way to remind yourself. It becomes a exercise in gratitude. Once you have experienced cold because you don't have a coat, then you'll appreciate the fact that you have a coat more.
And resilience. It cultivates
resilience. That's right. It cultivates resilience. One of the things that Seneca says at one point in one of his letters to his friend Lucilius is like, as you know, it's my habit to fast for several days once in a while. And it's like once I do that, then I come back home and all I find on the table is stale bread and a soup, and they taste wonderful. Because hunger it's a great spice. So there is that sort of stuff. There are exercises in physical adversity. Again, mild. The Stoics are not into extreme things. The notion is to practice
manageable.
Yeah, manageable. That's right. You don't. It's not. You don't want to do extreme things that might hurt you or something like that. That's not the point.
And social adversity too, right? Like wear ugly clothing and things like this.
Yes. Well, the Stoicism started out as a close cousin of cynicism. And the Cynics certainly were into, ragged clothing and, going into
rejecting societal norms intentionally.
Exactly. So the Stoics were were a little bit more moderate, but yes, the notion of, as Seneca puts it, is like trying out poverty, trying on your poverty a little bit. So go out, don't eat, go out with clothes that you normally wouldn't go out, etc. Again, the notion is simply to remind yourself that at the end of the day, you're actually lucky that you have those things. It's an exercise in appreciation and in endurance, because the Stoics think that, you may be lucky now, but luck it's a fickle thing and you cannot count on it. So if you establish your life on the basis of luck, on the basis of fortune, that's a bad idea. Your life should be based on your character, because that one you can work on, and it always stays with you no matter what. So if it is a time of, if it's a good time and luck is smiling on you, great. But don't take it too seriously, Seneca says, because otherwise, when luck then turns and you're going to experiencing a downturn, then you're not going to like it. You're not going to be able to. You're not ready for that kind of challenge, essentially.
these exercises also seem to be kind of like practical theorems that kind of stem from what I would call the axiom, which is the dichotomy of control.
Yes.
In a way, because
Yes.
could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. That is the so-called dichotomy of control, although that's a modern term, which I actually tend not to like, because once the people start talking about control, then all sorts of misunderstandings creep in. Epictetus calls it the fundamental rule, and that tells you that he thinks it's very important. The Enchiridion starts out with the fundamental rule. He says some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, and then he goes on listing the things that fall into one category or the other, and then he says a good life is one where you focus on the things that are up to you, and then you develop an attitude of equanimity and acceptance for the things that are not up to you. Now, that concept, my understanding is, it is actually found in a number of other traditions, including Buddhism and Judaism, and it's found in the 20th century Christianity. Probably several people here have heard of the Serenity Prayer, right? Which was written by an American theologian at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the Serenity Prayer essentially tells you the same thing. It tells you to ask God to give you the wisdom to be able to tell the difference between what you can change and what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot, right? That's basically the so-called dichotomy of control, or the fundamental rule. What's surprising, however, is what Epictetus says is or is not under your control. That's the part that it's kind of a little bit typical, specific to Stoicism. So he says basically that up to you are only your judgments, your decisions to act or not to act, and your values. That's
the three disciplines.
Right. That is the three disciplines. So that's it. Anything else is not really up to you, meaning that you can obviously influence other things. And I'll give you an example in a minute. But ultimately, other things depend on a lot of other variables, including other people, random events, etc. For instance, the first thing that he mentions that is not up to you, which may be surprising to some readers, is your body, your health. And one might think, wait a minute, hold on. Of course, my body's up to me, right? So I can go to the gym and exercise. I can eat healthy. I can go to the doctor and on a regular basis.
And you could still die of a heart attack.
And you can still die of a heart attack, or a virus can hit you, or a car
get hit by a car.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's exactly his point. He says, okay, so when you say things like, well, I can go to the doctor, I can go to the gym, I can eat healthy. What you're really saying is, my judgment is that those actions are more likely than not to be conducive to health. So it really comes down, once again, to your judgment, to your decision to act or not to act. But the outcomes of those actions, of those decisions, those are not up to you. Meaning that all you can do is to try. But it's like almost the opposite of Yoda in Star Wars. Isn't there one of the Star Wars where Yoda has just met Luke, and he says, "I'm going to try," and Yoda says, "No, there is no trying. There is doing or not doing." In a sense, Stoicism is kind of the opposite. There is only trying.
The archer metaphor. You want to
Yes.
speak to that?
Sure. The same idea is found in sort of nearby philosophies and philosophers from the ancient Hellenistic period. One of them being Cicero. Cicero was not a Stoic. He was an academic skeptic. So he was a member of Plato's academy during the skeptical phase, after Plato had already died. But he was very Stoic curious and Stoic ideation, so to speak. And he has this wonderful metaphor in the Finibus Bonorum and Malorum, which, by the way, it's my favorite title for a book. It translates to On the Ends of Good and Evil. I mean, it's hard to beat that kind of title. In the Finibus, Cicero at one point explains the Stoic system, the Stoic approach, and he uses this metaphor of the archer. He says, imagine you're an archer and you want to hit a target, let's say an enemy soldier, because we're talking about ancient Rome. So what's up to you there and what is not up to you? Well, you can practice archery before the actual battle. That's up to you. You can pick your bow and your arrows. You can take care of them. You can decide what the target is going to be. trying, to keep your focus as much as possible on the target and decide the moment in which you let the arrow go. That's it. After the arrow is left the bow, nothing is up to you. You may hit the target, or it may be that there is a gust of wind that ruins it, or the enemy soldier turns around, sees you, and ducks at the last minute. Now, the important bit is that Cicero says, it should be your goal to hit the target, but you shouldn't get emotionally attached to it. In other words, your self-esteem should not depend on whether you hit the target or not. It should depend only on whether you did your best. Did you do everything that was possible to it and was within your
preferred, indifferent?
Exactly.
And
hitting the target,
preferred, indifferent.
Right.
So on.
Right. So hitting the target is a preferred, indifferent. The important thing, however, is for which is up to you, is the preparation. It's the part that comes before the arrow leaves the bow.
That's what you can control. Yeah.
Exactly.
Excellent. All right. I have one more question before we switch it
Sure.
over to the Q&A. So given my personal interest in contemplative practices, as you know, I invited you to contribute a chapter to my anthology, the Routledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Meditation, which
Right.
you wrote a fine chapter for, and we interviewed you on my podcast on the topic. But while we're here today, can you share some of the ideas about meditation within Stoicism?
Yeah, so meditation for the Stoics is actually quite different from what most people nowadays think about meditation. I understand that in Buddhism, actually, there is a lot of different kinds of meditations, for one thing, and also that modern Westernized Buddhism is different from, the early Eastern version. So I'm not going to get into that one. But in terms of Stoicism, meditation is really more of a contemplation of certain ideas, right? So the idea is that you should be very much paying attention to your thoughts, but not in any kind of neutral way. And the goal is not to let them go. It's kind of the opposite. You want to figure out, why am I thinking this? And is this a good thing or not? And if it's not a good thing, you should gently, little by little, but try to replace that thought with something else that it's more useful, it's more conducive. Marcus Aurelius puts it in an interesting way. He says, your soul is dyed with your thoughts. And so what you think is important because it colors your entire soul, basically. Now, I just read recently a new translation of a 5th century book by a monk, John Cassian. And he talks about the same exact thing. He says, I have the problem of trying to, how do I direct my thoughts in the right direction and stay away from things that I don't really want to dwell on. And he says, well, one of the things that I do on a regular basis is to read or recite or even memorize certain passages from whatever books he thought were interested. And that's exactly what Marcus Aurelius does. Why is that? Because it turns out that, contrary to what our students seem to think, the human mind is actually not capable of multitasking. We simply switch very quickly between one task and another, but we don't actually multitask. That means that when you are engrossed in some kind of a task that takes your attention, such as reading and even more so writing, especially writing with an actual pen, the physical act of writing as opposed to just typing on a keyboard, your mind is completely engaged. And it doesn't have the luxury of starting thinking about other stuff. So one of the things that the Stoics were trying to do with their meditations was exactly that kind of practice, that kind of attitude. However, one of the things I think it's interesting about Stoic meditation is that Epictetus does use a particular word to identify this practice, prosoche. And if you actually look at the translation, prosoche in Greek just means attention. As in, paying attention to things. Consciously direct your attention to things. Now, in my mind, the Stoics there were way ahead in terms of psychology, way ahead of their time. Because it turns out that if you look at the literature, modern literature in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, there is, in fact, a very, very close relationship between attention and consciousness. They're not the same thing. Some people at some point thought that they were. They're not, because you can actually, it turns out we now have evidence that you can pay attention to things subconsciously. So they're not the same thing, but they are very tightly related. That is, once you decide to pay attention to something, your consciousness is completely engaged. There's nothing, it's not going to go into other directions. And that's pretty much the state that Epictetus is trying to trigger in his students. There is a word for it in modern psychology, and that's flow. This notion that when you're doing something that you're really paying attention, you're completely engrossed into it, you're totally in it, then you kind of lose even track of the passage of time. You're totally enjoying and focused on that particular whatever it is that you're doing. That's what Epictetus says we should be doing. We should get ourselves into these, what we today call flow, and just paying attention.
Yeah, great book by the same title by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who passed away about a year ago, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Great research. Thank you. Excellent answer. All right. So anything else you'd like to share before we open the floor to Q&A?
No, let's see what people had to say, what they want to talk about.
All right, folks. So you can just raise your actual hand or use the little icon thing that says raise hand or something like that if you'd like to ask a question or share a comment. Lou, let's go with you. Please unmute.
Yeah, just briefly, thank you so much, guys. This was a terrific presentation. And like you, Rick, I've heard Massimo in a number of contexts. We're colleagues. So this whole thing is also a wonderful plug for CUNY.
Absolutely.
CUNY professors in the hall, and it's so I'm glad to see this, and all the folks who've joined us. Thank you, everybody, for being in the room. Some of you we know well, others maybe not yet, but thanks for joining. So 3 quick ones, Massimo. Okay, is that fair enough? All right.
Sure.
Number one, the totally unfair question, because we get asked this all the time. Who's your favorite? So anytime you conglomerate a number of philosophers or journalists, is always say, but who's your favorite? So who's your favorite Stoic, Massimo? If you
that's easy, actually. It's definitely Epictetus.
Okay.
I read pretty much almost everything that's out there in terms of the ancient Stoics, and each one of them, of course, has a different personality and different perspectives. Marcus Aurelius is very moody, and it's kind of interesting to sort of read what he writes. Seneca writes beautifully. I mean, especially if you can read the Latin, it's impossible to mistranslate Seneca because it's so clear. So such a turn of phrase, it's amazing. Cicero, also an incredible writer, rhetorician, etc. But Epictetus, just to me, he just talks so bluntly. He's so like, he goes and talks to his students and say, you guys, you come here and study Stoicism, but then I see you out there, outside of the classroom, and you're a bunch of Epicureans. What the hell is wrong with you?
Sure. Well, he gets my vote too, Massimo, in case you were wondering. We don't necessarily agree on everything.
No,
but we certainly agree on that. That's a big one. So just a quick thing about discomforts. I don't know if it came up through because you have very interesting nuanced explanations and answers. So it's been a great dialogue. I was wondering about this aspect, though, of discomfort, in the sense that if one wants to achieve a goal worth achieving, then discomfort is inevitable.
Yeah.
So it's not just an exercise because it makes us feel more grateful later that we have comfort, but in fact, it's like putting the iron into the steel, iron in the fire to temper it. Yes, and that's isn't that back to Seneca?
Yes, it is very, very much, and that's absolutely right. So the exercises the controlled exercises in personal discomfort are supposed to do exactly that, to get you better and better for when the real test comes. During the pandemic, it was interesting because I saw a spike of people calling me up wanting to learn about Stoicism because, of course, the situation was difficult to handle, lots of stress, and et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, interestingly, during the pandemic, Marcus Aurelius' meditations shot to the best-selling list. Not surprisingly, I suppose. But one of the things that I told these people is like, look, I can give you certainly some pointers, but the problem is the emergency is already happening, and you are starting now to get prepared for it, right? It's like, to use an analogy, it is as if somebody were running after you to beat you up in the streets. You duck into a boxing gym and you say, can you teach me some boxing? It's like, Well,
Yeah.
I can, but you're still going to get pummeled because it's too late. You have to do it earlier. So the Stoics were very aware of this fact that, you cannot wait until the crisis is on. That's too late. You need to practice every day.
So
and that's the meditatio malorum is explicitly for that purpose. Yeah.
Right.
That's right. The premeditatio malorum, which is this notion that what you want to do is, if you're facing a challenge or a potential setback, you want to very carefully imagine a negative outcome and then how you deal with that negative outcome. The notion being that a prepared mind deals with stuff much better than if you're unprepared.
Well, that can backfire in a hurry, though, because you can start sending negative waves out there.
That's right.
I'm serious, and that's the third question. And like Rick, I lean into Buddhism a lot for things. I think it's very powerful too, or maybe in its own way, even more. But that's because of karma. So let me ask you, in your mind, is there space for, since we both acknowledged that Epictetus is the greatest Stoic, and we both, and you have extrapolated beautifully on the initial premise, but is it possible that that premise is not quite accurate, that it's not so black and white? Is in the sense of the Buddhist way of understanding that all phenomena are interconnected, and at bottom, that's because there are no phenomena. That's Nagarjuna's dialectic. But back to Stoicism, is it entertainable that we co-create our reality? In some respects.
Yeah, right. So yes and no. I mean, it depends on what one means exactly. So the ancient Stoics believed in universal cause and effect. So even also for them, everything is connected with everything else. They actually produced one of the early sophisticated theories of causality. Chrysippus of Solae, who was the third head of the Stoa and a great logician, apparently wrote a number of books. Unfortunately, none of them survived other than in fragments, about cause and effect. So they thought that everything is interconnected with everything else. They also had a concept of providence, because they thought that the universe itself is a living organism endowed with what they call the logos, the ability to be rational in a sense. And so we are literally bits and pieces of these cosmic organisms. We're kind of cells of the organism, which means that everything that happens to us is for the good of the organism in a sense, right? So you could go into that direction. Now, it gets more complicated when you get to modern Stoicism, because a lot of modern Stoics do not accept the notion of a universe as a living organism. They think along the modern scientific view of the universe as a set of processes regulated by what we call laws of nature. So that gets more
teleology. Thank you, Galileo.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's still a few vitalists lingering on the set.
Yeah, there are.
I mean, I'm probably one of them at the end of the day. So there is room, and if that's the case, then it seems to me anyway. Please, suggest your perspective. Then the first part, we can go back to the first part and revisit it and say, then the argument is really to judge what's in our control and what's not in our control. We have to supervene one on the other, because a lot of people probably suppose some things are out of their control, which may actually be in their control, and vice versa. Isn't it so?
It is, but that's exactly why when we were talking with Rick, I said I try to stay away from the word control at all. The so-called dichotomy of control is a concept that was actually, you don't find in ancient Stoicism. It's introduced by a modern writer, Bill Irvine, who actually is a colleague of mine, and he's a very, very good writer. He wrote 2 or 3 books on Stoicism. They're very good. But he called it, in order to sort of bring the terminology to the 21st century, he called it a dichotomy of control. And the problem with control is exactly what you just said. That is, but it's not a yes or no thing. It's a continuum, right? And if you're talking about control, you're absolutely right. If you're talking about, however, the way in which Epictetus puts it, what is up to me and what is not up to me, what is, in a sense, where does the buck stop, right? So if you make certain decisions and you act according to those decisions, then you made those decisions consciously, deliberately, etc., etc. It's fair enough to say, well, you're responsible for those decisions, right?
Okay, I get it. Massimo, you can take that line, and I think that's fine. I'm just saying this conversation, I'll stop here, turn it over. We have another hand. Great.
Okay.
So thank you. I really enjoyed dialoguing with you.
Thank you.
But it's great. But listen, this then becomes the worm Ouroboros, which eateth of its own tail. Because if you're gonna transform this from control to, what's up to me, okay, that only begs the question, so who am I?
Yes.
And so if you can answer who am I, then you can know what's up to me. But I'm not sure that that's easy to answer.
Yeah. Well, yes, it's a different conversation. The Stoics do have an answer for that one. You may or may not like it. But let's see what's the next question.
Well, I see two questions in the chat. One is from Michael Swanson. Is there a tension? This is sort of what Lou was just asking you. Is there a tension between one, having control of some mental things, and two, no control over bodily things, and his non-dualism, i.e. mind is physical? Disclaimer, haven't read the book yet.
That's a fair disclaimer. So the Stoics, in a sense, have a psychology that is very close to, at least most aspects, I guess, of modern cognitive science. As I said, cognitive behavioral therapy came out of Stoicism in the 1950s and 60s. The first practitioners of CBT were directly informed by the Stoics, especially by Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. So their psychological theory would actually probably be very familiar to people. Their idea is that who we are, to actually, in a sense, go back to what Lou was asking a minute ago, who we are is our prohairesis. It's our faculty of judgment. It's that's it. There's nothing else. Everything else is not really us. My arm is not me. My foot is not me. Those are incidental parts that are part of my body. But really, the only thing that is truly fundamentally me is my prohairesis. Now, that doesn't mean that the Stoics, however, had a notion of a permanent self, because their metaphysics was very strongly influenced by Heraclitus, one of the pre-Socratics. And so it was what we today might call something like process philosophy. That is, they thought that everything changes, right? Heraclitus' famous phrase, pantare, everything changes, everything is never the same. The famous metaphor of you never step into the same river twice. The same goes for your prohairesis. Your prohairesis changes all the time. It's informed by the kind of stuff that happens to you. It's a self-informed. You have the ability to change your own judgment by applying your rational faculties to themselves. Essentially, that's how you learn. That's how you change things. So it's not a stable, essence of any kind. And as I said, it dies, according to the Stoics, with your body. Once you're dead, you're done. You're done. I did a little bit of research in modern sort of neuroscience on this. And basically what the Stoics are talking about is what modern neuroscientists refer to as the executive center of the brain. The executive center is essentially this area around here, is the frontoparietal lobes, and is the part of the brain that is in charge of your decision-making, your rational thinking, and all that sort of stuff. So that's what Epictetus was talking about. Now, they do realize that even that, strictly speaking, is not entirely under your control, in two ways, and those are important. One, they were aware of the existence of what we would today call subconscious thoughts, right? So Seneca, for instance, says, there are situations where you blush and you don't control it. You have thoughts that just come out, and there's nothing you can do about it. You just let them go. It's not a thing you can actually control. You don't have any agency on it. So that's one thing. The other one is they were aware of dementia. They were aware of the fact that accident or disease can impair your prohairesis. And Seneca there says, in one very poignant letter that he writes to his friend Lucilius, he says, I hope to be able to, as he puts it, slip the cable before I get to that point. In other words, to commit suicide. Because he says, once my mind is gone, I'm gone. That's it. There's nothing else. The Stoics approved of suicide under very restricted conditions. The bar was very high. Epictetus talks a lot about it. He calls it the open door. He says, every time that the door is always open, you can walk through it. But most of the times you should stay, because it's your duty as a human being toward other human beings to stay. But there are situations where that is an acceptable option. And one of them, certainly at least for Seneca, was if you see yourself slipping, then you might at some point make that decision.
Great. Mike Garrigan asks two questions. First one is, what's Stoicism's view on compassion?
Yeah. That's interesting. That's a complicated one, actually, because they do have a view of compassion, but it's nuanced. So the short version of it is, we are supposed to engage, to actively practice anthropophilia, that is, loving every other human being. And so compassion in the sense of being as charitable as possible to other people, being as helpful as possible to other people, that's definitely a Stoic thing. In fact, you should always try to abstain from judgment about other people. Epictetus says to his students, don't say that guy drinks too much. Say that he drinks. You don't know what it's too much or not. You don't know him. You have no idea what he's doing and why he's doing it. Don't jump to conclusions, to judgments about other people. In fact, it goes even so far as endorsing Plato's and Socrates' view of the fact that nobody does evil on purpose, right? That the true root of evil is ignorance. Ignorance, of course, has to be qualified here, not in the sense that people without a college degree are evil or something like that. We're talking about ignorance as in really lack of wisdom. That is, people who don't really understand what they're doing. And Epictetus has this really interesting analogy where one of his students says, shouldn't we, get rid of that guy? He's a thief, and the other guy is a murderer. Shouldn't we kill him? And Epictetus says, well, hold on. Would you say that you need to kill a blind man because he's blind? And the student says, well, no, of course not. But that's a different situation. And Epictetus says, no, it's not. The blind man cannot tell black from white. The person you call a thief or a murderer cannot tell right from wrong, but they're both impaired in some fundamental faculty. And so what you should do is, if anything, is to help them. You should have compassion for them. Now, that's not to say, of course, that you don't stop them from doing whatever they're doing, hurting other people. But once you do that, the notion is that you should be compassionate. You should never ever say that those people are bad, evil, or something like that. They're just misguided. They're people who don't know what the right thing to do is. And if possible, because it may not be possible, but if possible, your duty is actually to help them. Marcus Aurelius at some point says, I'm sorry, it just occurred to me. Marcus Aurelius, along similar lines, says, that person annoyed you, that person angered you and all that. Well, you can teach them. And if they're not receptive to your teaching, that's why you got endurance. You just deal with it. It's not, what are you going to do? That's what human beings do. Similar
to the Buddhist attitude of people who misbehave, it's causes and conditions. And if you were under those causes and conditions. But the other thing I was going to say is this is also related to the idea of cosmopolitan and this concentric circles model that includes all, not just human beings, but even sentient beings, the circle of ethical care, right? About treating and mistreating others.
Yeah, so the notion of these circles of concern comes from a 2nd century Stoic writer named Hierocles. He wrote something called The Elements of Ethics, and he uses this metaphor. He says, look, you're the center of your own concerns and attention, because that's normal for a human being. Then the next circle is your family, and then the next circle after that is your friends, and then after that is your fellow citizens, and then your fellow countrymen, and then the rest of mankind, etc. And he says, what you should do, you should try to grab these circles, contract them, and bring them closer and closer to yourself. So start by treating strangers as if they were countrymen, treating countrymen as if they were friends, treating friends as if they were family. And he actually says you should go around as a practice and addressing strangers as brother, sister, uncle, aunt, and so on, depending on their age and gender. So there is this notion. Now, the ancient Stoics did not expand that outside of humanity. They were very clear that the kind of beings that you can deal with are rational beings, and there are only two kinds of rational beings: humans and gods. That's about it. Modern Stoicism is, of course, moving in that direction. One of the authors that I recommend in terms of modern Stoicism, especially in terms of ecology and the kind of the sort of things we're talking about, is Christopher Gill, and he's in the UK. I forgot exactly where. I think in Exeter, and he's written a couple of books about this. Where, of course, the next step is any sentient being. Right? It's from the modern perspective. I don't think you can do any better than Jeremy Bentham when he said that the important thing is not whether they talk or think. The important thing is whether they suffer.
Yeah, that's a Buddhist idea as well.
Right. Yeah.
Sidebar, I just remembered the Gotham Philosophical Society, the director of that is my former classmate, Joe Beale.
Ah, yes.
Beale.
Yes.
Yeah, we all know Joe. All right, so Mike asked another question. Does Stoicism accept paradox? Mike, do you want to amplify that question? It's pretty vague. Or just leave it.
Yeah, you mean logical paradoxes?
Mike, would you unmute yourself?
Not necessarily logical
Okay.
paradox. I come from more of a Taoist philosophical view of things.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes beyond reasoning in some views. So I guess the question is because it's Stoicism, it would be addressed, excuse me, with logical paradoxes.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that one of the big Stoics, ancient Stoics, was Chrysippus of Sole, who was a logician. In fact, people have argued seriously that he was the greatest logician in antiquity, even more so than Aristotle. The only reason we usually don't hear about him is because all of his books did not survive. But Stoic logic did. And Stoic logic actually was very influential throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period. And it has actually not been surpassed until the late 19th century, early 20th century. Frege basically was doing his work on the basis of Stoic logic. He was aware of Chrysippus and similar authors. So yes, if we're talking about the Stoics, we're talking about logic in the sense of reason, rationality, in the broad sense. They didn't mean logic only in the formal sense, although they did, of course, that as well. But good reason. The Stoics were really a combination of empiricists and rationalists. They thought that there are two sources of human knowledge, and those are our senses ultimately, and our ability to think about stuff. And so that's what they focused on. Now, it's interesting you use, of course, the word paradoxa. So in ancient Greek, paradoxa just means unusual opinion. And the Stoics were very much into paradoxes in that sense. In fact, Cicero wrote a whole book called Stoic Paradoxes or Paradoxa Stoicorum, where, however, the kind of paradoxes we're talking about are things like, for instance, virtue is all or nothing. Only the sage is virtuous, everybody else is a fool. And things like that. Now, when you hear those things, there are six, I think, that Cicero talks about in his book. And when you hear those things, you cannot help but say, "What the hell are they talking about? What is that? What does that mean?" My personal interpretation, but it is personal. I don't know that ancient scholars would necessarily agree. But my interpretation of what the Stoics were doing is that those were conversation pieces for them. Those were kind of the equivalent of a bumper sticker. And then they would get the conversation started. Like, you go around, you go to the Stoa Poikile, which is where Stoicism, the painted porch, where Stoicism started in Athens. And you talk to people and say, you're all fools. Only the sage is wise. You can be guaranteed that somebody's going to raise their hand and say, what the hell do you mean by that? And that gets you into an interesting discussion. And the discussion there is that, for instance, for this particular paradox, The idea, I think, underlying that paradox is one of humility. That is, all of us, except the sage, are fallible and can be mistaken about all sorts of things. It's pretentious to consider yourself a sage. Seneca says that sages are as rare as the phoenix, the mythological bird that comes out of its own ashes. According to Roman mythology, that happened once every 500 years. So there's not that many sages going around, right? So the notion that that everybody is a fool and that virtue is all or nothing is really meant to say, look, we're all imperfect to different degrees. The Stoics refer to themselves as prokoptontes, those who make progress. So there is a sense of progress. You can get better, but you're not getting there until you become a sage and sages. I'm guessing this is not really that different from Buddhism. I mean, there are not that many people that achieve enlightenment, right? Isn't it kind of something that similar idea? Yeah, there are enlightened people. There are sages out there. Maybe Socrates was one. Who knows? But they're rare. And if that's your goal, at some point there's an interesting bit where reported by Cicero, where the middle Stoic Panicius is talking to one of his students, and his student says, "So, how would the sage deal with falling in love?" And Panicius looks at the student and says, "Well, as for the sage, I don't know. You and I, however, are not sages. So let's deal with it in the way in which human beings that are not completely wise, would actually do it." So those are the kind of paradoxes that they're thinking, but it's something different from what you're talking about. And the Taoism part is the Taoism approach, from what I understand, is very different. That said, there is at least one bit in the Meditations where Marcus Aurelius sounds to me like a Taoist. But again, this may be my ignorance. There is a point in the Meditations where he says that whenever you have an obstacle or a perceived obstacle in front of you, don't charge at the obstacle. Don't butt your head against the obstacle. Find a way that is given to you by the obstacle itself. That is, turn what you perceive as an obstacle into a new way of doing things. And at least superficially, that sounds to me not far from a Taoist approach.
That was a really rich answer. Two short things, and then we'll go on to the next question. One, I think Chrysippus is the same guy who once said he was very happy when he finally internalized the ability to have dialogues with Socrates in his own self.
That sounds right.
Reading about him. And the other thing about paradoxes and progress, like in the Meno, this kind of paradox of wisdom or knowledge, if you don't have it, you can't see it, right. Therefore it's impossible at recollection and all that. There must be partial knowledge, right? So this is related to the idea. But the general idea, I think, of the Stoic paradoxes is that, like the Meno, these are philosophical inquiry prompts.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly. And that's kind of one of the interesting things about, to me at least, about Epictetus is that at the same time, he tells his students that logic is crucial, but you don't want to overdo it. So he says at one point, one of his students asks him, so should I learn logic? Why should I learn logic? And Epictetus says, well, would you like me to present you with an argument for why you should learn logic? And the student says, yes, please. And Epictetus responds, well, how would you know if the argument is correct unless you actually know logic? Like, oh, damn. But at the same time, he also chides his students and he says, I see you guys, you keep reading Chrysippus and trying to extract all of his wisdom from his logic, but then you don't practice it. You don't actually put it into practice. And it's like, so what are you doing? You're just literary critics who read Homer, but don't write a line of poetry of their own. And I think that's a nice way of putting the notion that logic is absolutely useful, but you don't want to do it for its own sake. You want to do it if it's actually useful, if it actually changes your life.
Yeah, informal logic is applied logic.
Right.
Yeah. So there's a pretty lengthy question by August Locke.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered writing a book that's a dialogue between Epictetus and Buddha? Is it even possible for Stoics with intellect, ratiocination being the mode of their inquiry to speak to Buddha, who seems to rely on a different mode of inquiry to understand the human condition? Perhaps their conclusion will be the same, but the method used to arrive there would be different. That's a question.
Yeah, and that might be incommensurable in some respects. No, I would never write a book like that, for one thing, because I don't know enough about Buddhism to actually pretend to write a book like that. But also, absolutely, that the thing is, there are a lot of similarities, from what I understand, especially in the ethics, between Buddhism and Stoicism. Much less so in the metaphysics, but certainly in the ethics. And some of them are kind of astounding. I mean, they keep coming up. So much so that people have actually suggested at some point that maybe there was some kind of cross-fertilization. We do know that one ancient Greek philosopher, Pyrrho of Elis, actually did go to India with Alexander the Great, and he did talk to these people that he refers to as gymnosophists, the naked wise men.
Yeah, the yogis, probably.
Yeah, they were probably yogis. But this was about the time where Buddhism was already developing. It was already 2 or 3 centuries old. So who knows? It's possible that there was some kind of cross-fertilization. Although Pyrrho became a skeptic, certainly not a Stoic. But no, I would not dare write that kind of book. That said, I went to Athens last year. And I was walking down the major archaeological site, and just off of the Agora, I saw these temporary, I think they removed them now, but these 2 statues, life-size statues. One was Socrates and the other one was Confucius. And I thought it was a really nice image of these 2 traditions, these 2 sages, who probably would find interesting things to say to each other, and it was stunning because they were right there in front of me with the Acropolis in the back, and it was a really stunning view.
Very nice. So the next question is a little related, from Danianos Petros. Can you comment on the connection of Buddhism with the view of Epictetus that the human psyche is part of the divine and can be perfected by one's own efforts?
Well, as I said, I'm only going to comment on Buddhism as little as possible because I read about it, but not enough to feel confident. That said, the view that the ancient Stoics have about the mind as a spark of the divine, it's actually pretty clear. As I said, we are literally cells, bits and pieces of the cosmic organism, and we share in the logos. Now, what that does for the ancient Stoics, it makes sense of a lot of other things that otherwise might sound really bizarre. There is a famous passage in the Discourses where Epictetus says, when you go to bed, kiss your wife and your child goodnight, and remember, however, that they're mortals, so that if they die, you shall not be disturbed. Now, you read that passage, you say, what kind of a psychopath is this guy? Right? What do you mean I shouldn't be disturbed if my wife or child would die? But in the ancient Stoic notion of a providential universe, that makes actually perfect sense, because everything that happens to us, including dying, of course, is good for the organism, for the living organism that is the cosmos. Epictetus uses this really nice analogy. He says, imagine that you're a foot and you're part of the body, and the body has to get home, and there is a muddy path there to be crossed. Well, guess who's going to have to step into the mud? The foot, right? And if you think of it only as a foot, forgetting that you're part of the body, you're going to think this is disgusting. I don't want to do it. It's not my thing. But if you realize that you're part of the body, and that actually is your reason for existence, that's what you do. You bring your body home, then not only you're going to do it, you're going to be happy about doing it. You embrace your, as Nietzsche famously said much later on, it's amor fati. You embrace your fate. You love your fate, right? In a modern analogy, it would be like we are individual cells of the body, of the cosmic body, right? Now, my cells do have to do their job, and part of their job is to die. If they don't die, I get cancer, right? If they start replicating and not dying, I get cancer. That's not good for the body. So from the point of now, if one of my cells were to look at it from the point of view just of the cell, they would say, well, that sucks. I don't want to die. But if they understand that they're part of the body, then they say, that's the way it works, and I'm happy to do it. So that's the way the Stoics looked at it. Now that does create a problem for those modern Stoics who do not think that the universe is a living organism, right? And I include myself into that group. So what you're left there is that there's no providence. There is still universal cause and effect. Still, everything that happens is bound to happen. You're still interconnected with everything else. But if your wife dies, it does suck. And the only thing you can do about it is to endure it, to accept it in the sense that you don't embrace it anymore, but you do accept it because, well, death is a natural process. What am I going to do? There's no way to do it. So there is still acceptance. There is still a sense of interconnectedness, but you do not have that sense of embracing your fate, as the ancient Stoics would.
Thank you, Massimo. Patricia Murphy, hi, good to see you. She has a question for you.
Your last point especially made me convinced I wanted to ask my question, which is about good and bad.
Yeah.
I meditate and have done so for 30 years on several of the passages of the Enchiridion. And one of them is 27. And it says, just as the target is not set up to be missed, so nothing bad by nature happens in the world.
Right.
And I've often thought he could have easily said, so nothing good by nature happens in the world. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. That's a very interesting point. Well, the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, thought that everything, there's nothing bad about that can happen, but there is good. And the reason for that is because the universe is, again, a living organism endowed with reason. So the organism does good things, right? Although good here is understood as good for the organism, not necessarily for the individual cells or the individual organs of that living organism. But it certainly is good for the organ. Yes, go ahead, sorry.
And it just seems that there's a great deal of emphasis on the fact that when we make judgments, we judge things to be good or bad.
Well, so the Stoics technically are supposed to limit the words good and bad only for things that are up to us. In other words, only for our own judgments, right? The only things that is truly good for a Stoic is my good judgment. And the only thing that is truly bad is my bad judgment. Everything else is preferred or dispreferred. But it's not really good. It has value, right? So they use the word axia, which in Greek means value, literally. And so things have value. So, for instance, having money has value because it makes your life more pleasurable and all that sort of stuff. But that value is actually given to the money only by the fact that you decide to use it in a certain way. There is a passage in the Discourses where Epictetus says, oh, well, consider money. How are you going to use it? Money itself is not going to tell you. It's up to your proairesis. It's your faculty of judgment that has to make use of it. Therefore, the so-called indifference, literally the things that don't make a difference to your judgment, are preferred or dispreferred depending on how you use them. So even some modern Stoics make a mistake there, I think, because there's a tendency to present what we think of positive stuff as preferred, like money, health, right, reputation, good reputation, etc., as preferred, and then the opposite, like poverty, lack of education, sickness, etc., as dispreferred. But that's actually not true because it depends again on the context of the single agent. You don't want a very healthy Hitler. So for Hitler, health is not a preferred indifference; it's a dispreferred indifference. We don't want a healthy Hitler out there. We don't want a rich Hitler either. So money is also dispreferred as far as that particular individual is concerned, and in the context of the rest of humanity. So things are not inherently preferred or dispreferred. What makes them so is your judgment. Is if you're using them in a good way, then they're preferred. If they're not, they're dispreferred. But technically, that was the major difference between, that's not true actually, but one of the major differences between Stoicism and Aristotelianism, right? So Aristotle,
Stoicism and
Aristotelianism. So Aristotle famously said that, in order to have a eudaimonic life, a good life, a life worth living, you do need to act virtuously, and the Stoics would agree, right? So they agree on that bit. But you also have to have some of the externals. You have to have, a little bit of money, a little bit, good health, a little bit of good looks, that sort of stuff. Not a lot. You don't need a lot, but enough, because otherwise you're screwed. If you're really ugly, if you're poor, you're sick, that's not a good life. For the Stoics, that's not true. For the Stoics, the only thing, strictly speaking, that is necessary and sufficient for a life worth living is virtue, is a good character. The rest has value, and so it can make your life easier or more comfortable or something like that. But even if you are, in fact, sick, poor, uneducated, etc., you can still be a good person, and your life is still worth living. And vice versa, you can be rich, very healthy, very famous, etc., but you're a son of a bitch, in which case your life is actually not worth living, according to the Stoics.
Great.
One more just comment and question, if I could.
Sure.
I often think that an area that is too little studied with Epictetus is this notion of will of nature. And even in 27, as I said, it says nothing by nature happens in the world that is. Right. And I wonder, can you recommend somebody I can read that really goes into the nature of nature?
Oh, that's a great question. One of the people that is definitely worth reading in that respect is Anthony Long. Anthony has
Introduction and the Enchiridion.
Yeah. So Anthony has published two or three books on Epictetus. One is, I forgot the exact title, but one is about Epictetus as a Socratic philosopher, and that really goes into a lot of that, the kind of things you're talking about. He also wrote an interesting little book. So I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but the Princeton Press, over the last 2 or 3 years, has put out a number of books, and they continue to come out in a series that it's called Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers. And these are small books. They are new translations of the classics. They started out with the Greco-Romans, but now they're expanding into other directions. They're never the full book, so they're not full new translations of, let's say, the discourses or anything like that. They tend to be edited and editorialized. There is this running commentary by the translator on certain things, and they're meant for a general public. These are not for scholarly consumption, so to speak. But Anthony wrote one of the first ones. It's called How to Be Free, and it's a new translation of the Enchiridion, plus a number of selected passages from the discourses. And in the introduction, Anthony goes into a little bit of the details of what we're talking about, and he elaborates on the notion that for Epictetus, the root of our freedom is the ability to make decisions, because that's the most human thing we can do. If somehow we lose that one due to disease or whatever else, then we're essentially not ourselves anymore. Right? And it's a radical conception of freedom. Remember, of course, you know this, but perhaps not everybody here is aware of it, but Epictetus was a slave.
That was my next question.
Yeah, right.
You didn't mention anything about that. And,
right,
a lot of times I feel that is central to understanding this psychological liberation that he is preaching.
Right. Yes, it is. At the same time, I don't like to overemphasize it because to me, one of the attractive things about Stoicism is that it was practiced literally from the slave to the emperor, right? Epictetus to Marcus Aurelius. So it kind of covered the whole gamut, essentially, in society. But yes, you're right. Of course, if we're trying to understand Epictetus as an individual, as a human being, the fact that he was a slave, in fact, we don't actually know his name, his real name. Epictetus just means acquired. Right? So we just know that he was a slave. That's it. He does talk a lot in ways that are shocking to us, modern readers. I'm teaching a course on Stoicism right now this semester at City College, and I on purpose started out with the Enchiridion because it's kind of shocking. He refers to his students as slaves. He's like, you slaves. And he's like, whoa, hold on a second here. Because of course we come to that particular word with the baggage of colonialism and post-colonialism. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about slavery to money, pleasure, the kinds of things that the Stoics say are actually indifferent. They're not what will make a good life. And he says, you guys are slaves to that kind of stuff. But he uses very blunt kind of language, and I just love it.
Massimo, this has been wonderful. We actually went over a couple of minutes, so I want to thank you, but I always want to give our guests the last word. So if there's anything you forgot to mention, would like to mention, or plug your latest book, or tell people again how they could reach you, whatever.
Thank you.
You get the last word.
It has been a real pleasure. Yes, if people want to reach me, you actually mentioned that in the beginning, but my website is Massimo Pigliucci, my first and last name, no spaces, nothing, .org. And there they'll find all sorts of stuff, links to both my scholarly career and my outreach. And then, yes, the new book that I'm actually particularly proud of, it's Beyond Stoicism. It's coming out on January 7th. And it's co-authored with my friends, Greg Lopez and Meredith Kuntz. And it is really an interesting, I think, voyage among 13 different ancient philosophy, Greco-Roman philosophies. We cover everything from Pythagoreanism to Neoplatonism, but always with a practical aspect in mind. So each chapter has a component of, so you want to live like a Pythagorean. What would that look like today?
Eat some beans.
Eat some beans, that's right.
Awesome. That sounds great. I'm definitely looking forward to that. Well, Massimo, thank you so much. Today was a great conversation. I want to thank everybody who brought questions and everyone else who's here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this will show up on YouTube soon, whenever Lou is done editing it. All right, folks. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.
We'll see you
Bye-bye.
again soon. Take care.